Thank you, Reverend Ingrid. I think that was like a lovely segue into, I think now, like practically, like what does all of this mean, right? I think oftentimes when we talk about theology, we kind of get lost in that. And so for me, I was hoping to focus on like mental health specifically, and particularly about this idea of like, what does Islamic mental health look like? So I wanted to start that by telling you all a story. Well, part of a story. Many of us here are probably very familiar with the story of how Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family began his mission. That he was meditating in a cave when he has this like glimpse of truth, and is blessed with sacred vision. But what we don't often talk about when we speak about that story is how he responds in the immediate aftermath of that moment. The earliest of Muslim biographers tell us that his reaction was a deeply human one. In the face of the divine and of his new role as a messenger, he is overwhelmed, emotionally fraught. He's filled with awe, anxiety, even fear. Ibn Ishaq, who is our earliest biographer, even tells us that at one point, the Prophet, peace be upon him and his family, actually considers throwing himself off the mountain on which he sits. And so here, at the very beginning of our faith, we see an example of what might be called, let's say, emotional fragility that we all carry as human beings. The Quran talks about the Prophet, peace be upon him and his family, as a beautiful example, a model to be emulated. And yet even he has these moments where he reaches the limits of his ability to manage and comprehend. So while there are, of course, many ways in which any of the stories that we receive from the revelation and from the lives of our prophets and messengers can be understood, the pathway that I wanted to take today was about mental health. Because while I would never say that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him and his family, had a mental illness, as a human being, I would say that he had mental health, because all of us as human beings, every single one of us, have mental health. Like our physical health, our mental health is part of our day-to-day experience. And like our physical health, it will fluctuate. These fluctuations are a normal part of our lives. Everybody has good days and bad days, days where we feel excited and hopeful and joyous, and other days where we might feel lost or unmotivated or discouraged. Those struggles are part of how we live and learn and grow as human beings. And as we've noted earlier, those can be struggles that help us to build resilience and to find meaning. And for most of us, most of the time, we're able to do that. We're able to find meaning and purpose in our struggles. But sometimes we experience events or emotions that fall outside of our ability to manage and cope. The example of the experience of revelation is, of course, a unique one, and one that we will not experience in the way that we would have seen in many of our traditions, but we do all get overwhelmed. That might be the result of loss or grief or trauma. It might be this continued struggle that we have against multiple barriers that might make day-to-day living difficult. It might even be that our brains and our bodies are wired differently, and that makes it harder for us to manage things that seem normal for other people. And so the reality is that mental illness is as much a part of our life as physical illness. According to the Canadian Mental Health Association, by the age of 40, 50% of Canadians will have experienced a mental illness at least once in their lifetimes. That's not a small number. That's half of us. Half of us at some point experience circumstances that impair our mental health, that make it difficult for us to cope. Mental health, therefore, doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter how smart or how kind or how honest or how wealthy or even how religious or how faithful we are. Anyone can experience mental illness, just like anyone can experience physical illness. And interestingly enough, This was precisely the position of Muslim scholars and civilizations, which is ironic because so often I hear Muslims tell me that mental health is a new concept, something that comes from outside of our tradition rather than from within it. As someone who practices Muslim mental health actively, I can tell you with certainty that that is so far from the truth. Muslims and Islamic civilizations have historically been at the forefront of conversations about mental health and have often been pioneers in the recognition and treatment of mental illness. So, for example, did you know that the very first psychiatric wards and hospitals that we know of in the world were founded by Muslims in Muslim empires? This idea that those who suffer from mental illness should be cared for and treated with kindness is rooted in the Quran and in the general ethos of compassion and justice that is at the heart of Islam. And it was that ethos that prompted Muslim physicians to set up special spaces for the treatment and care of those suffering from maladies of the mind. Psychiatric hospitals or special mental health wards were set up as early as the 8th century. The first that we have documented was in Baghdad, and then they kind of grew and went to other spaces. So while other places in the world were still struggling through these ideas, this would have been at the same time that Europe would have been in what we call the Dark Ages. Muslim scholars were developing what they called ilm al-nafs, the science of the self, which is a precursor to modern psychology. So scholars like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina were writing case histories that talked about mental disorders as medical conditions to be treated with psychotherapy and medication. They were creating comprehensive lists, classification lists of mental illnesses. They were providing descriptions for conditions that ranged from depression to mania, and treatments that range from what we would think of as psychological treatments to other ones that were based on physiology or on community care or on holistic models of health. And that's the core of the issue, that in all of these cases, health was seen as a holistic thing, that mental health was part of one's larger well-being, just as physical health and spiritual health were. And so mental illness was approached with the same kind of care and compassion and rigor that we saw Muslim physicians treating physical illness with. So that's my little history 101. But of course, I said that we were going to figure out, what does this mean for us, right? We did all the philosophy, we've done a bit of history, now what? So I wanted to go back to this story, right? The story of what happens when revelation comes to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family. And so he eventually makes his way home to his beloved wife, and he tells her what has transpired. And Bibi Khadija, may Allah be pleased with her, not only believes him, but she reassures him and she helps him to believe in himself. Ibn Ishaq, this biographer I mentioned, tells us that Allah comforts the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his family, through his wife. In the biography you'll read, he says that she strengthened him, lightened his burden, proclaimed his truth, and belittled men's opposition. I have always seen this story as a lesson for us all. So when we know that someone is struggling, when they are confronting fear and anxiety for whatever reason, when they're discouraged, when they're feeling depressed, are we following the example of Bibi Khadija? Multiple studies have shown us that social support is a major factor in both prevention and recovery related to mental illness. But so often the disclosure of a mental health issue actually results in a loss of social support rather than an increase. And that support that somehow seems to go away is also at the heart of how we address those inequalities that I talked about earlier, those things that help us to build resilience. It's only together through community care and solidarity that we create pathways to healing, as Reverend Ingrid mentioned. And so it's of the utmost importance that when we find out that someone that we know is struggling with mental health, with their mental health, that we reach out with encouragement and love and kindness. And it's important to remember that everybody Everyone here knows at least one person who is struggling, because up to half of us are at any given point in time. Reaching out can be something simple, like asking how someone is doing. But it's important that when we ask these questions, we be as kind and as considerate as we can. So, for someone who's struggling with anxiety and who's finally managed to make it to church or to the masjid, asking them why they haven't been coming might not be a helpful thing. For someone who's dealing with depression due to a recent job loss, asking them what they're doing now might not be productive. But that doesn't mean that we stop talking to each other. Quite the opposite is true. As communities, we have so much power. We have the power to change lives and to create inclusion and to foster hope. So we have to tap into that power and harness it to help one another. And because I like really tangible, practical solutions, I like to suggest that we ask different things in different ways. Broad, open-ended questions. How are you doing? Or you can just say, Salam, it's so nice to see you. Regardless of the approach that we take, what I think is most important is that we do our best to emulate the example of Bibi Khadija, may Allah be pleased with her, and focus on the person that's in front of us and what that person might need in the moment. What matters most is that we're present and that we're genuine and that we're ready to listen to whatever that person chooses to share, whether that's something big or nothing at all. We can also work towards breaking down those systemic barriers that result in so many of our mental health challenges by working together to ensure that Islam's vision of justice, but also Christianity's vision of justice, is realized for all of us. A world of love, of equity, of generosity, and of hope. We do that by ensuring housing and healthcare and community and compassion for every single person within our reach. Finally, there is one other thing that I find particularly helpful when we're dealing with our own emotional fragility, and that's where I wanted to end my part today. When Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family was sitting at the top of this mountain, reflecting on what had happened, contemplating his life, even thinking about maybe ending it, it's said that it was the angel Jibreel who helped to safeguard him. Now, we might not all be blessed with an angelic encounter, but faith can be a powerful ally and a guiding light in times of darkness. Our faith doesn't give us immunity against times of trouble or the emotions that come with them, but it can help us. That understanding is also the final piece of the story of Revelation. So it's said that at one point there was a lull, a period of time during which no further revelations came. And Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family was understandably very concerned and worried. But when Allah finally spoke, those words were a comfort. These verses of Surah Duha continue to be used to this day to help people in difficulty. And so I wanted to end with those today in the hopes that they can help us along our own journeys. It says, by the morning brightness and by the night when it grows still, your Lord has not forsaken you, nor does he hate you. And the future will be better for you than the past. Your Lord is sure to give you so much that you will be well satisfied. Thank you.